May 16, 1985. Inside the Kremlin's gilded halls, a new leader takes his oath. Mikhail Gorbachev stands before the portraits of Lenin, radiating youthful energy in a room full of dying men. The world watches and waits. Western analysts predict he will strengthen the Soviet military. Intelligence agencies prepare for a new arms race. Everyone is looking at the missiles. No one is looking at the balance sheet. And that is the fatal mistake, because the Soviet Union wasn't going to be destroyed by American bombers or NATO tanks. It was going to be killed by its own accountant with a single decree about vodka. The empire didn't fall because it lost a war. It fell because it went bankrupt. And the weapon that drained the treasury wasn't a missile. It was a bottle. The Soviet Union in 1985 looked invincible from the outside. Red Square on May Day was a spectacle of raw power. Tanks rolled past Lenin's tomb in perfect formation. Intercontinental ballistic missiles gleamed under the spring sun. Fighter jets screamed overhead, trailing red smoke. This was the nation that had crushed Nazi Germany and put the first man in space. It controlled 11 time zones and commanded the loyalty of half of Europe. The Kremlin's walls were thick. The gold reserves were legendary. The nuclear arsenal could end civilization 7 times over. To the average American watching the evening news, the Soviet Union looked eternal. It looked unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The men who ran this empire knew a secret that terrified them into silence. The Soviet economy was dying, not slowly, not gradually. It was hemorrhaging, and the wound was self-inflicted. For decades, the Soviet state had built its budget on 2 pillars. The first was oil. Black gold pumped from Siberian fields and sold to Europe for hard currency. The second pillar was stranger and darker. It was vodka. The state held an absolute monopoly on alcohol production and distribution. They made vodka for pennies. Fermented grain, potatoes, water. Nothing fancy. But they sold it at a massive markup. And the Soviet people bought it by the millions of liters. They bought it because life in the workers' paradise was gray and cold and crushing. The propaganda promised abundance. The reality delivered shortages. You couldn't find decent shoes or fresh meat, but you could always find vodka. By the early 80s, alcohol sales accounted for somewhere between 15 and 20% of all state revenue. Think about the scale of that. 1/5 of the entire Soviet budget came from selling alcohol to its own citizens. It was the drunkard's tax, a self-destructive cycle where the state profited from the misery it created. The Soviet Union was a drug dealer addicted to its own product's revenue. The leadership knew this was insane. KGB reports detailed the catastrophe. Male life expectancy was falling. In the industrialized world, people were living longer. In the Soviet Union, men were dying younger. Life expectancy for Soviet males had dropped from 67 years to 62 in just 2 decades. Industrial accidents were epidemic. Drunk workers destroyed expensive imported machinery. Agricultural equipment sat rusting because tractor drivers were too intoxicated to harvest the crops. Absenteeism on Mondays was a national joke. The entire economy was running on a permanent hangover. But here was the trap, the addiction. While alcohol destroyed productivity on one side of the ledger, it was absolutely vital to revenue on the other. The state needed sober workers, but it also needed drunk customers. For years, the aging Politburo chose the revenue over reform. Leonid Brezhnev, who was no stranger to the bottle himself, simply ignored the crisis. They were addicted to the easy money. Then in March 1985, everything changed. Gorbachev took power. At 54, he was young, energetic, and catastrophically naive about economics. He was a true believer in socialism. He thought the system just needed discipline and moral renewal. When he looked at the Soviet Union, the first thing he saw was the bottle. He was morally disgusted. His wife Raisa reinforced his conviction that alcohol was the root of all evil. Gorbachev decided that his first great act as General Secretary would be a war on vodka, a total war. He did not consult his finance ministry. He did not ask what would happen if 20% of state revenues suddenly vanished. He was operating on ideology, not arithmetic. It was a fatal error. In May 1985, just 2 months into his reign, Gorbachev launched the campaign. The decree from the Central Committee was brutal and swift. Vodka production was slashed overnight. Liquor stores could only open from 2 in the afternoon until 7 at night. That schedule made it nearly impossible for factory workers to buy alcohol. Hundreds of stores were shuttered in Moscow alone. The price of vodka was hiked dramatically. But the campaign went beyond restricting sales. It became a cultural crusade. Gorbachev ordered the destruction of vineyards across the Soviet Union. In Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, bulldozers ripped out vines that had been cultivated for centuries. These were world-class vineyards that generated export revenue. It didn't matter. They were flattened in the name of sobriety. Farmers wept as their heritage was destroyed. Movies were re-edited to remove drinking scenes. Soviet classics had to be recut. The Bolshoi Ballet was told to remove alcohol from its productions. State television flooded the airwaves with propaganda showing happy workers drinking mineral water and juice. It was a reality that existed only on screens. For a brief moment it seemed to work. Official statistics in late 1985 showed a drop in alcohol consumption. Workplace accidents decreased slightly. Crime rates dipped. Gorbachev declared victory, but he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had confused the supply of legal alcohol with the demand for alcohol itself. The Soviet people were not cured. They were just forced underground, and when they went underground, they took the money with them. Almost overnight, the USSR transformed into a nation of bootleggers. Homemade alcohol called samogon flooded the black market. It was rough, dangerous, and sometimes deadly, but it did the job. The primary ingredient for making samogon was sugar, and that is when the real crisis began. In late 1985, sugar began disappearing from store shelves across the Soviet Union. Panic buying set in. People weren't buying a kilo for their tea. They were buying 50-kilo sacks to ferment into alcohol. The state planning agency, Gosplan, was caught completely off guard. They had meticulously planned the economy 5 years in advance, but they hadn't anticipated that banning vodka would create a run on sugar. The supply chain collapsed. By 1986, sugar had to be rationed. Long lines of angry babushkas stood in the freezing cold for hours just to get their monthly sugar coupons. But the ingenuity of the thirsty citizen knew no bounds. When sugar ran out, they turned to other sources. Candy, tomato paste, cheap cologne, window cleaner, even shoe polish. anything that contained alcohol or fermentable sugar. The consumption of these toxic surrogates led to a spike in poisonings and deaths. Any health gains from reduced vodka consumption were erased. While the people brewed moonshine in their kitchens, the Soviet budget began to bleed to death. The financial impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. In 1985, the budget deficit was already a concern. By 1986, it had exploded. The loss of alcohol revenue tore a hole in the budget worth approximately 100 billion rubles over the life of the campaign. Let that number sink in. That was roughly equivalent to the entire Soviet defense budget for an entire year. Gorbachev had effectively defunded his own government in a moral crusade. Normally, a government facing a revenue collapse would cut spending or raise taxes, but the Soviet system was rigid. Gorbachev couldn't cut the military budget because he was still locked in the Cold War with Ronald Reagan. He couldn't cut social subsidies because the social contract of communism guaranteed cheap food and housing. He couldn't raise taxes effectively because the black market, the samogon economy, was completely untaxable. So the deficit grew and grew, and then the second disaster struck. For nearly a decade, the structural rot of the Soviet economy had been masked by high oil prices. The USSR was one of the world's largest exporters of oil and natural gas. Billions of petrodollars flowed into Moscow from Western Europe. That hard currency allowed the leadership to import grain, buy technology, and ignore the failures of their own industries. Oil was the anesthetic that kept the patient numb. But in 1986, Saudi Arabia grew tired of losing market share to other producers. They decided to flood the market. The price of oil collapsed. It plummeted from around $30 a barrel to just $10. It was an economic apocalypse. In the span of a single year, the Soviet Union lost its two biggest sources of income: internal revenue from vodka, external revenue from oil. State income was slashed by nearly half, but expenses remained exactly the same. It was insolvency. The impact on the streets was immediate and brutal. Without hard currency from oil, the Soviet Union could no longer afford to import consumer goods, or even food. The shortage economy went from being a chronic nuisance to an acute crisis. Store shelves went from sparsely stocked to completely bare. People joined lines without even knowing what was being sold at the front. It might be sausage. It might be boots. It might be toilet paper. You bought whatever it was because it might not be there tomorrow. Money began to lose its meaning. A pocket full of rubles was useless if there was nothing to buy. Samogon became a de facto currency. You paid your plumber in samogon. You tipped your taxi driver in samogon. You bribed officials with samogon. The bottle that Gorbachev tried to banish had returned as the most stable unit of value in the collapsing empire. The state had lost control. Inside the Kremlin, panic set in. Gorbachev's advisors presented him with grim spreadsheets and dire projections. The country was running out of cash. They needed money to pay wages, fund the military, and keep the lights on. Gorbachev faced a brutal choice. He could admit defeat, reverse the alcohol ban, and try to stabilize the budget. Or he could double down on perestroika, hoping that economic restructuring would eventually generate new wealth. He chose to double down. But economic reform takes years to bear fruit. The bills were due today, so the Soviet government did the only thing it could. It turned on the printing presses. The state bank began printing money to cover the budget deficit. Billions of new rubles flooded into the system. But because there were no goods to buy, this extra money just chased the few remaining products. It drove shortages deeper and fueled hidden inflation. At the same time, the government began borrowing heavily from the West. They took out loans from German, French, and British banks using their dwindling gold reserves as collateral. They were borrowing hard currency just to buy grain because their own agricultural sector couldn't feed the population. By 1987, the Soviet Union was living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The optimistic energy of Gorbachev's early days had evaporated. It was replaced by sullen anger. The war on vodka was quietly abandoned in 1988. Restrictions were lifted. The state tried to regain control of the market, but it was too late. The damage was done. The state machinery for producing and distributing alcohol had been dismantled. The vineyards were gone. The black market networks were now firmly controlled by organized crime. The state had lost its monopoly, and it never got it back. The billions of rubles that should have gone to the treasury were now flowing into the pockets of gangsters. The moral crusade had not only bankrupted the government, it had inadvertently funded the rise of the Russian mafia. By 1989, the Soviet Union was effectively a bankrupt corporation masquerading as a global superpower. To understand the final collapse, you have to look at the deficit. Before 1985, it was manageable. After the twin shocks of the vodka ban and the oil crash, the deficit exploded to nearly 100 billion rubles by 1989. That was roughly 10% of the entire gross national product. In a capitalist country, a government can finance a deficit by selling bonds to investors. But the Soviet Union had no bond market. It had no investors. It only had the state bank. So the government ordered the bank to create money out of thin air. This created what economists call a monetary overhang. Imagine a country where everyone is paid their salary every month, but the shops are empty. The money piles up in pockets, under mattresses, in savings accounts. It is hot money desperate to be spent. But there is nothing to buy. By 1990, the Soviet people were sitting on hundreds of billions of rubles that had nowhere to go. This destroyed the incentive to work. Why work an extra shift for 50 rubles if those 50 rubles can't buy a pair of boots? Why harvest wheat if the rubles you earn are just colored paper? The labor force checked out. Collective farms stopped selling grain to the state at official fixed prices. The money was worthless. They started hoarding food or trading it on the black market. The unified economic space of the Soviet Union began to fracture into 15 separate survivalist economies. This was the moment when the economic crisis mutated into a political one. The 15 republics that made up the USSR watched the chaos in Moscow with growing fury. Ukraine, the Baltics, Georgia, Russia itself. They saw a central government that kept demanding resources but could no longer provide anything in return. Moscow couldn't provide investment. It couldn't provide goods. It couldn't provide a stable currency. The war of laws began. It was a tax rebellion on a continental scale. The leaders of the republics decided to stop sending tax revenue to Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected leader of the Russian Republic, became the champion of this rebellion. He told regional leaders to take as much sovereignty as you can swallow. More importantly, he told tax collectors to keep the rubles in Russia, starve Gorbachev's central government. Gorbachev was still president of the Soviet Union. He was still commander-in-chief of the nuclear arsenal. But economically, he was a pauper. He had a massive bureaucracy to pay, an army to feed, international debts to service. But his income stream had dried up. He was a king without a treasury. Desperation drove him to humiliating lengths. The superpower that had terrified the West for 4 decades was forced to go begging. Gorbachev appealed to Germany, France, and the United States for loans. He needed hard currency not to build factories, but simply to buy food. In the winter of 1990, the Germans, grateful for reunification, provided billions in aid, but it wasn't enough. The Soviet credit rating collapsed. Western banks realized the USSR was insolvent. Ships carrying frozen meat and butter anchored off the coast and refused to unload until payment cleared. The checks were bouncing. Inside the country, the supply chain disintegration reached a breaking point. It wasn't just luxury goods missing. It was the basics of civilization. In the summer of 1990, the tobacco rebellion broke out. Cigarettes disappeared from shops. In a nation of heavy smokers, this was the spark for riots. Angry crowds blocked streets in Leningrad and Moscow, demanding smokes. Gorbachev had to urgently appeal to Philip Morris to fly in emergency shipments of Marlboros to prevent a revolution. Then soap disappeared. Then laundry detergent, then medicines. The Soviet Union reverted to a primitive barter economy. Factories stopped transacting in money. A tire factory would pay workers in tires. The workers would stand by the roadside trying to trade a tire for a sack of potatoes. A glass factory would trade sheet glass with a furniture factory for tables. The ruble was dead. The only things that held value were US dollars, which were illegal but everywhere, and vodka. Vodka became the liquid currency of the collapse. You paid your plumber in vodka. You bribed doctors with vodka. You tipped taxi drivers with vodka. The state had lost control of the alcohol market, and in doing so it had allowed alcohol to replace the state's own currency. As 1990 turned into 1991, the atmosphere was apocalyptic. The social contract was shredded. The people had neither freedom nor security. They had only lines. It was common for a Soviet citizen to spend 4 to 6 hours a day waiting in lines. They stood in freezing rain, clutching string bags, hoping to buy milk or gray sausage. But the dying regime had one final brutal card to play. The government knew there was too much money chasing too few goods. The monetary overhang was fueling hyperinflation. Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov convinced Gorbachev that the only solution was a surgical strike on the money supply. On January 22, 1991, just as the evening news ended, an announcement stopped the nation's heart. Effective immediately, all 50 and 100 ruble banknotes were no longer legal tender. It was confiscation on a massive scale. The government gave citizens exactly 3 days to exchange old notes for new ones. But there was a strict cap. You could only exchange about a month's salary. Anything else you had saved was instantly worthless. Panic swept across 11 time zones. In the dead of winter, millions rushed into the streets. They gathered outside banks that hadn't opened yet. They tried to break down doors. Desperate grandmothers who had saved for decades wept as they were told their money was gone.